On all of the planet Earth, there is no other place like the Everglades. This wetland is a unique and special wilderness. Here on the southern tip of Florida exists a world of water, sawgrass plains, and hardwood hammock islands in which life abounds. But the future of this natural treasure is uncertain. The Everglades is a wetland in peril. The story of this marsh begins with water, because water is the lifeblood of the Everglades. Once the Everglades was a vast sheet of water that covered most of Florida's southern peninsula. The water flowed 100 miles from the north to the south as a 70-mile-wide unbroken river that gently swept to the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. This river averaged only 18 inches in depth, yet it shaped the largest wetland on Earth. 3,000 years ago, water moved naturally through a glittering sea of sawgrass plains. Hardwood hammocks dotted the landscape. Majestic cypress trees and oaks grew in the subtropical wilderness. Their branches were covered with countless orchids and tufted air plants. The river of grass flowed around the hammocks, and on its journey supported a seemingly endless variety of life. Today, the course of the river of grass has been broken by the development of man. Only this small patch of the Arthur R. Marshall Loxahatchee Wildlife Refuge in the northern Everglades and parts of Everglades National Park remind us of its earlier splendor. In the wetlands, the link between the past and the present is the eternal cycles of the wet and dry seasons. These cycles of nature shape the marsh and the lives of the creatures who live in it. In winter, when it's dry, water recedes into the deep holes of the sawgrass plains. Many of these holes were dug by alligators. Fish and other aquatic life are concentrated in these pools and become easy prey for birds like this blue heron. Near these pools are the ibis and other birds. During the winter, they build their nests and breed to take advantage of the plentiful supply of food found in the water holes. But as the seasons change, so must the habits of the wildlife. In the summer, rain fills the holes and the wetlands to overflowing. Shallow pools of water that once nurtured teeming varieties of aquatic life spill over into the sawgrass plains, carrying the fish with it. The fish are spread over a wide area, making the search for food more difficult for birds, such as this great blue heron. The cycles of wet and dry seasons portray the delicate balance of life in the wetlands. This is a fragile system in which all living things depend on climate, geography, and one another to survive. In the Everglades, every creature is linked together as part of a complex food web. In this web, each form of life is either a predator or a food source. This red-shouldered hawk is eating a field mouse. He is like all wildlife, which play a role in nature's plan. The hawk is trying to survive as a species which fills a niche in the ecosystem. By eating the mouse, the hawk is keeping life in balance. He is preventing one form of life, in this case the mouse, from overwhelming other creatures. But the hawk and the mouse represent only one example of a predator and prey relationship, out of the many that make up the wetlands food web. If one link of this web of life is lost, others might quickly follow. This apple snail is the only source of food for the endangered snail kite. The snail lays its eggs on the sawgrass just above the waterline. If the sawgrass dies, so does the snail. The end of the apple snail could mean extinction for the beautiful snail kite. The apple snail and snail kite are a very small piece of a food web mosaic, a mosaic that is composed of many food chains. A food chain begins with small creatures who eventually are consumed by larger ones. A mosquito larvae may become dinner for a mosquito fish. The smaller fish is prey to a bigger fish. And as the chain grows, birds may eventually feed on the fish.
At night, in the fall and in the spring, the air is filled with birds that are migrating through this area. Birds in the numbers that are almost incalculable to count, because there are whole populations of birds coming from their wintering areas in the Caribbean and South America, moving on up into the northern parts of the continent. And a good many of those birds, this is a landfall when they're coming from the south, and they will stop here and they will spend time replenishing their fuel sources, the fat under their skin, so they can go on migrating, and they'll be foraging on the insects that are at the end of another food chain.
In the Everglades, there are many different food chains that make up the food web. And resting at the top of the food web is the alligator. As the largest living creature in the marsh, it feeds on birds and fish. The story of the alligator shows how the environment also places natural limitations on its inhabitants. This primeval creature has not changed in over 135 million years. Yet, just as in the past, their survival is determined by the characteristics of the environment in which they live. The alligator, which was endangered, has made a remarkable comeback. Today, 20,000 alligators call the northern Everglades home. They are prolific, but their numbers are limited by the amount of food available and the size of the habitat. When a species is at its maximum stable population in an area, biologists call this the carrying capacity of an ecosystem. This part of the Everglades may have reached its carrying capacity of alligators. It can support only those alligators who live here now, but no more. In the northern Everglades, the alligator is in a successful yet delicate balance with the wetland. Intimate partners in this unending cycle of life and death in the marsh are the plants and trees. Trees like these myrtle offer shelter and nesting areas to birds. The birds spread the seeds of the trees. Flowers rely on bees to help carry pollen to other flowers. It is a constant dance of life in which each species needs others to perpetuate its life cycles. As we've seen, living things depend upon nature's timeless wet and dry seasons and one another to survive. They also rely on the geology of the Everglades. These kids are taking a field trip to the marsh out of the Loxahatchee Environmental Institute. They are beginning their exploration of the Everglades, starting at its foundation, the limestone base and overlying peat. The Everglades sits atop porous limestone. Underground limestone rock forms a water reservoir called an aquifer. Like a sponge, the rock holds and purifies water that filters down to it from the surface. Plants that have died continuously accumulate on top of the limestone base, forming a layer of decayed material called peat. This organic muck helps to keep the water in the wetlands and provides many of the nutrients for plants, insects, and wildlife. As the river of grass flows to the south, the layer of peat is reduced and the limestone becomes more exposed. Less soil and lower elevations mean different types of trees grow in the southern portion of the Everglades from the northern portion. In the south, mangroves and oaks reign, while in the northern Everglades, there are myrtle and red bay trees. The Everglades is such a delicately balanced ecosystem that even the smallest changes in elevation create completely different habitats. A few inches above sea level, aquatic plants prosper. Slightly higher, a wet prairie of sawgrass flourishes. And just 18 inches above the sea, a hardwood hammock island could be established. The plants and trees that live in the wetlands have evolved over millions of years to require very small amounts of nutrients to live. When a plant dies, it decays. The rotting plant releases minerals and other nutrients into the water. The sawgrass roots trap and use these nutrients. It's a never-ending, self-perpetuating system in which wetland grasses cleanse the marsh naturally of occurring contaminants by using them to grow. The grasses depend on their own life and death cycle to maintain the natural balance of one of North America's most important wetlands. Water flow, seasons, and geology used to be the forces of nature that determine the survival of the northern Everglades. But sadly, like the setting sun over an Everglades hammock, the natural glory of this wetland wilderness is beginning to fade.